The negotiations in Abu Dhabi between the Ukrainian, American, and Russian delegations did not lead to a major breakthrough and will continue next week. But still, the first leaks of information have appeared about what exactly was discussed at these negotiations. In particular, the talks were about creating buffer zones and having the ceasefire monitored by American or European troops. And here you have to gather all the information bit by bit. On one hand, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that there is now a clear understanding of the need for American monitoring and control over the process of ending the war and ensuring real security. At the same time, the Russian side added in this context that Ukraine, the United States, and Russia discussed the creation of buffer zones and mechanisms for controlling them in Abu Dhabi. At the same time, Russia continues to insist that Ukraine completely withdraw its armed forces from Donbass and hand over the territory to the Kremlin, which the Russians have not been able to capture in almost 12 years of war. Ukraine, of course, rejects this idea. At the same time, Russian Z military correspondents have started spreading information that supposedly Russia agrees to pay reparations and restore Ukraine's energy sector at its own expense, as well as supply cheap gas after signing a peace agreement. And this is yet another trap from the Kremlin, which might seem quite acceptable to the White House. But Russia itself, in between rounds of negotiations, massively attacked Ukraine with missiles and drones. Well, and Lukashenko, as you know, suddenly announces an urgent readiness check of the Belarusian army, and since January 16th, he's been rattling his sabers. So let's sum up Abu Dhabi and sort everything out together. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. This is very important for promoting content on YouTube. I would appreciate it, and also subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video, and there we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, according to the American side, the trilateral talks between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine in Abu Dhabi were positive and constructive, but without any details. It is known that President Trump's advisors, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, want to try to reduce disagreements on the key issue of territorial control in eastern Ukraine. The talks took place against the backdrop of another massive missile and drone strike by Russia on Kyiv and other cities carried out overnight. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russian forces launched 370 attack drones and 21 missiles of various types. And here, the Axios agency reveals an unexpected detail about these talks. This is what I mentioned in previous episodes, that these are the first direct talks. Here is the quote. The talks began on Friday and continued on Saturday, with a joint meeting of American mediators with Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, as well as a direct meeting between Russians and Ukrainians without the presence of Americans. Well, as you understood, there were also direct talks with the Russians, most likely between Budanov and Kostyukov, but what exactly was discussed? And this is the most interesting part. Let's clarify the situation regarding these negotiations. Now, as they say, watch closely. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky said that he received a report from the Ukrainian delegation about the results. And he immediately pointed out that military personnel were present at the trilateral negotiations and from all three sides. Zelensky stated that the main issue during the trilateral meeting was the possible parameters for ending the war. Remember, there were military representatives from all three sides and moving forward. Key quote, I really appreciate that there is an understanding of the need for American monitoring and control over the process of ending the war and ensuring real security. Zelensky noted that the United States raised the issue of possible formats for approving the parameters of ending the war and what security conditions are needed for this. And what do the Russians say about this? The Kremlin stated that Ukraine, the United States, and Russia discussed the creation of buffer zones and mechanisms for controlling them. They said that this is exactly the security parameter that was discussed during the negotiations of the Russian delegation, quote, they discussed various aspects, buffer zones, and different mechanisms. And it's important to note that the two-day negotiations were held in a highly closed format, the location was not disclosed, and there was no press accreditation at all. After that, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that Kyiv expects at least some answers from Moscow and a willingness to end the war started by Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Zelensky noted that it is too early to draw conclusions about the content of the negotiations, and much will depend on their continuation and the results of the next round. That is, as they say, now all sides have returned to their capitals to pass on the information to their leadership and discuss what to do next. And here we come back to the buffer zones and the issue of monitoring the ceasefire compliance. Volodymyr Zelensky insists that America should take on the role of the force that will monitor the ceasefire on the ground. Europe, as you know, proposes to send its troops to Ukraine, while Russia also suggests creating buffer zones. And obviously that's exactly what was being discussed. Why am I so sure? Take a close look at the composition of the delegations. Here we'll go back a bit to Zelensky's statement about the military. The Russians sent military personnel and a former intelligence officer, Kostyukov, to these negotiations. Ukraine did the same, but the key question is, who was in the American delegation? Now pay attention. The American delegation included Trump's advisors Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Josh Grunbaum, who is responsible for military procurement. What is very important, and even more importantly, the United States Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll and the commander of the United States European Command Alexis Grinkovich were also present. So this time it was clearly about troop deployment, which is why the delegations were formed this way. As you can see, there were military officials everywhere. Just a reminder, the Russian group was led by Admiral Igor Kostyukov, head of Russian military intelligence. Kirilo Budanov, now head of the president's office and formerly Ukraine's intelligence chief, is on the Ukrainian side. Notably, Russia is discussing buffer zones. Zelensky says he values the United States' willingness to monitor and oversee the process of ending the war and ensuring real security. And the Americans are sending military commanders to these negotiations. Although it should be acknowledged that there hasn't been any major breakthrough in the talks. Really. The only unresolved issue remains the question of territories. Putin is demanding Ukrainian troops leave Donbas areas Russia hasn't captured in 12 years of war. Ukraine is obviously against this, but what expectations can there really be from negotiations when, in between negotiation sessions, what is Russia doing? Russia launches, as it later became known, 396 drones and missiles at Ukraine, including 396 and Zircon missiles. The Russians are already suggesting that if Ukraine doesn't concede, they should escalate attacks on civilian energy infrastructure to pressure Ukrainians into agreeing. And here, Russian propagandists began to introduce and throw into the information space the thesis that supposedly Vladimir Putin is now trying to sell Donald Trump the idea of reparations, as if Russia is allegedly ready to pay reparations to Ukraine. He said some frozen Russian assets in the United States might go toward restoring territories, but reparations would be paid in a rather unusual way. And I admit that such an idea was being pitched by Putin's representative Kirill Dmitriev to Donald's team because he has already hinted at this before. And the idea is that, as part of a peace agreement, Russia promises Ukraine to repair and restore all the energy infrastructure at its own expense and even supply cheap gas and possibly oil. And this is just another trap from the Kremlin. Why? Because Putin, realizing that he can't take control of Ukraine by military means, is trying to do it in a hybrid way. Putin is counting on convincing Donald Trump that Russia can fully restore Ukraine's energy sector, but using Russian technologies and so on. And then the Kremlin gets total, not just complete, but truly total control over all of Ukraine's critical infrastructure. We all remember how Russia blackmailed Ukraine with gas, even shutting off the pipeline to force political decisions favoring the Kremlin. We definitely don't need those reparations. Overall, these negotiations are just a show for one audience member. Ukraine is desperately trying to show the Donald Trump administration who is who in this war, while at the same time demonstrating maximum constructiveness and willingness to negotiate. Russian attacks on the energy sector during negotiations also show that Russia does not want to end the war. But the irony is that Russia, taking advantage of Donald Trump's lack of discernment, is trying to do the same thing. Convince him that it is Ukraine that is unwilling to negotiate. They even offered her control of the energy sector, but she still refuses to give up Donbas. So this has been dragging on for a whole year now, while Russia is also trying to freeze the Ukrainians, and Trump just keeps talking about how impressed he is by the resilience of the Ukrainians. I'll leave it at that, friends. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video, it says support the channel Alexei Pechiy. Choose any format that is convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.